Correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like SpongeBob Season 5 was the point where people started to notice the show's dip in quality. While it did have plenty of episodes that a majority of the fans really enjoyed, there were also a lot more bad episodes than the previous seasons. As for myself, I have a bit of mixed feelings about this season. There were plenty of really good episodes, but the quantity of bad and mediocre episodes were a lot more notable this time around. And today I'm going to take a look at the best and worst of Season 5. Of course, as with most lists, it's all subjective. My list will differ from yours, and I won't look down upon you if you disagree with me. So with all that said, let's get started with the top 5 worst episodes of Season 5. Number 5. A Flea in Her Dome. After returning from her science convention, SpongeBob and Patrick throw Sandy a welcome home party. However, during her trip, she's contracted a flea that goes rampant all over the tree dome and ends up on SpongeBob and Patrick. Eventually, the flea reproduces, which sends off more fleas in the tree dome. It's up to SpongeBob, Patrick, and Sandy to rid the fleas from her home before they suffocate the tree dome. It was a toss-up between this or Fungus Among Us. And while that episode is a lot more graphic and grotesque, I felt like A Flea in Her Dome had a lot less to it than Fungus Among Us. Most of this episode is just SpongeBob, Patrick, and Sandy trying to survive an infestation of fleas in the tree dome. And yet it never once comes across as interesting or funny. Pretty much the only scene that managed to get a laugh out of me was with the bus driver.
Welcome home, Sandy. You know that. We missed you.
No! No one wants to hear you sing!
Sorry, SpongeBob. He's got a fierce no-singing policy.
But outside of that, there's just nothing to say about this episode. To paraphrase what a guy whose name will not be mentioned said when he discussed this episode, there's no build-up, no resolution, just fleas. 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 Ugh. I don't want to talk about this episode anymore. Now I'm the one who flees.
It's gonna be all right. We will help you. Okay, you know what? None of this would have happened if you didn't come back with your infestation.
Number 4. To Save a Squirrel. In this episode, Sandy is preparing for a camping trip, but she refuses to take SpongeBob and Patrick for their safety. So they decide to sneak into her truck, but they end up falling off the truck with a bunch of camping supplies that they end up destroying and using up, leaving them stranded with very little means of survival. They later take refuge in a cave, but the lack of food causes them to find ways to eat each other in order to live. This is just an episode that gets even worse the further we go through it. SpongeBob and Patrick got a bit frustrating during the first few minutes of the episode, and the more time I spent watching them, the more annoyed I got, because they barely say or do anything that is actually funny. But I think the worst part about this episode is the ending, where it's revealed that Sandy concocted the whole thing to test SpongeBob and Patrick's survival skills, by having them attempt to try to eat each other just to survive. Are you nuts, woman? They could have killed each other! And yet you're glorifying that they were doing it? What the f***? It might just sound like I'm overthinking this, but even as a kid, I never looked forward to watching this episode. So much so I felt opted to change the channel until the episode was over. And if that's not a sign about how bad this episode is, I don't know what is.
You're making soup out of me!
I was not! It was supposed to be stew!
Number 3. Spy Buddies. Having not attempted to steal the formula in a while, Krabs assumes Plankton is planning something huge. So he tasks SpongeBob and Patrick to spy on Plankton to see what he's up to. But even with high-tech gadgets, they don't really make for good spies, and this eventually causes more trouble. Now, I am fully aware that this episode got a positive reception from fans, with most people calling it one of the highlights of Season 5. But I'm just gonna be blunt with you all. I don't get it. Maybe it's just the fact that I'm not the biggest spy fan, but as a kid, I never found this episode really interesting. And it all comes to the fact that SpongeBob and Patrick make for terrible spies. I get it's the joke of the episode, but the way it's executed isn't even that funny. Like those stupid laser pants, just... Ugh. I didn't even like that joke when I first saw it as a kid. And I watched Breadwinners when I was younger. And given the gap between releases, that's saying something. Plus the ending just made no sense and went way over my head. Mr. Krabs and Plankton swapping places just because... I have no idea. It's just complete and utter nonsense. Which, I'd be fine with those kinds of episodes as long as it made me laugh. But I just didn't crack a smile once watching this episode. If you're fine with these kind of stories and like this episode, then that's fine. But personally, if I want a story about a spy who's too stupid to even do his job, then I just watch Cars 2.
You got a lot of AKAs, Alex, but I guess that makes sense, seeing how you's wanted in France and Germany and the Czech Republic.
Okay. Keep your voice down.
He's so good.
You're an idiot!
Number 2. Whatever happened to Spongebob? In this episode, Spongebob is preparing for his day, but his antics end up frustrating his friends to the point they call him an idiot boy. Hurt by their words, Spongebob decides to leave Bikini Bottom so he won't bug his friends any further. But following an accident, SpongeBob suffers amnesia and finds himself in New Kelp City, where he comes across a gang of bubble haters. Meanwhile, SpongeBob, Patrick, Squidward, and Krabs realize what they did to SpongeBob and they go and search for him. This is probably... no, scratch that. Definitely my least favorite special of the first 3 seasons. At least with the prior specials, I can at least say they had that one element to justify it as a special. Be it a grander or serious story, or a bit of moments with Patchy the Pirate. But nothing about this episode justifies its half-hour runtime. There's no moments with Patchy the Pirate outside of the special intro, and there's nothing grand or special about it like with Have You Seen a Snail, Pest of the West, or Dungeons and Dragons. Not to mention the characters in this episode are really unlikable. SpongeBob's friends acting insensitive towards him was completely jarring, especially Patrick and Sandy. Yes, they do eventually regret their actions, but it's still completely out of character for them to blow up at SpongeBob like that. And the fact that the episode relies on this part is even worse. And SpongeBob's side of the story isn't really anything interesting either. In fact, that's another problem with this episode. I didn't care. It's just another one of those stories where one of the characters gets amnesia and doesn't remember anything. That doesn't make for an interesting episode, let alone a half-hour special. In fact, calling this a special is a bit of a stretch. At least Atlantis SquarePants has tried to justify its extended runtime, but this episode just lacks the elements to make it a special. And even outside of that, the rest of the episode is just bad. It's just not worth my time.
If I'd known that was the last time I'd ever see SpongeBob, I would have slammed the door in his face even harder.
Number 1. Waiting. In this episode, SpongeBob purchases a cereal box that contains a free prize, but he misreads the label as it has a prize offer. All SpongeBob has to do is send in box tops and his free toy would be mailed to him. So SpongeBob and later Patrick wait for the mailman to come and deliver his package. But SpongeBob starts to lose touch with reality as his package takes longer to get to him than expected. This episode really pissed me off, and it usually takes a lot for me to get riled up. This entire episode relies on the characters constantly talking, yelling, shouting, fighting, thinking all of it would keep the young children's attention. But in actuality, it just makes the entire episode feel incredibly punishing to sit through, because everything that's happening is so obnoxious. And I'm not kidding, they never shut up.
Hey, buddy.
What do you want? Can't you see I'm doing something here? I've been mean to Gary, and I flipped Sandy. And now you hate me because I'm a big jerk. Just send in 99 box tops. You ruined my free toy. Oh, Gary, not now. Can't you see that I'm waiting for the mailman? Doesn't anyone understand this?
And this all comes down to SpongeBob's portrayal in the episode. He acts even more juvenile than usual, and constantly blows up at his friends like an asshole. All because he's constantly waiting for the mailman to come in and deliver his toy. Even to the point where he has a mental breakdown when it takes forever for his toy to arrive, and when he presumes that the toy he got was completely broken.
I ate box tops, and then I'm waiting, and then he came, and then we're waiting, and then my toy, and then you, and then Snap, and then this.
Ah! It's so infuriating! Yes, he had his rather childish side, but not to this degree! How do you fucking mess that up? Ugh, I'm sorry if I sound like I'm being a bit overly dramatic, but here's the thing. That's all this episode has to offer, and it's just insufferable. While I should be thankful that this episode isn't as long as most other episodes, that doesn't save it from being the worst episode of Season 5.
There, now see? It's supposed to do that.
Hey, my toy's okay!
Good. Now will you two be quiet?
Look, Patrick! Squidward fixed it!
So those were my least favorite episodes of this season. Now it's time we took a look at the best episodes of this season. This time it was a bit more tricky on what to put during the lower half of the top 5. While I was a bit more confident with the higher ranked episodes of this season, I kept going back and forward on which episodes would make the rest of that list. And oh boy, I am gonna get a lot of hate for my number 5 pick, so let's just get this over with. Number 5. Atlantis Squarepantis. In this 1-hour special, SpongeBob and Patrick come across the missing half of the Amulet of Atlantis, which happens to be a distant utopia home to advanced cultures in art, riches, science, and weaponry, as well as their longest living bubble. So they take the missing half and place it on the other half to open the path to Atlantis, where they, along with Squidward, Sandy, and Mr. Krabs, travel to the Lost City. There, they get to see their advanced cultures. However, Plankton tags along with them undetected and tries to find his way into the Atlantean artillery. Now, I will admit that Atlantis Squarepantis is certainly rough around the edges. There are a few elements that make no sense or come off as distracting. One of the biggest being Plankton's involvement, which adds nothing to the story. Not helped by the fact that it comes out of nowhere. And despite the fact that this is a musical, it's weird that they casted the musician David Bowie as the Lord Royal Highness, but not even give him a musical number. Plus, I'm gonna be honest, I never really cared for the Patchy segments. The third one, when he had the hallucinations, was kinda charming, but it just didn't do anything for me. So, why is this on my best list then? Well, there is one thing about this episode that stands out to me. The world building. I found the way that Atlantis was presented in this episode to be really interesting. It wasn't the best example, but it still caught my attention. The culture and riches of Atlantis are really spectacular. On top of that, the visuals are really nice to look at. I was never really bored when watching it. I legitimately wanted to see more of what this place had to offer. And I know a lot of people say that the songs in this episode are really bad and unnecessary, but I actually found myself enjoying these musical numbers. The only exceptions are the 2 songs that were played when they were in the bus. I don't know, there's something about them that just didn't really work with me. But the rest of them I found pretty decent. And heck, some of these songs have really good looking visuals that tie into the character's personality or interests. Again, I know this isn't a flawless episode, and you can point out some of its problems very easily. But I feel like the episode isn't given enough credit for what it does well, be it the visuals or the world building.
This painting is so realistic, it looks like you could step straight into it. And you can!
Whoa.
This place is amazing!
Number 4. The Battle of Bikini Bottom. In this episode, SpongeBob and Patrick find themselves in the middle of a battle recreation. There, Patrick reveals how he and his ancestors never clean themselves, which comes across as a nuisance to SpongeBob, who prefers good hygiene. This fractures their friendships to a point one tries to fix one another, leading to all sorts of hijinks. This is how you do a gross out episode. Like, outside of one moment, there wasn't that many moments where I was too grossed out with the visuals, because the way they show it off isn't too over the top or cringe inducing. In fact, the episode actually takes advantage of the gross out moments, with how the plot revolves around clean versus dirty. And at times, it actually does pay off. There were plenty of funny moments throughout this episode that had me laughing. Like with how Patrick explains the history between cleanly versus filthy, and the ways Patrick and SpongeBob try to one-off each other. They could be pretty creative.
Got your nose!
Hey, give it back!
Not until you wash your hands.
Oh, yeah? Well, I got your eyeballs! Huh?
But again, it's not all perfect. They do sneak in one visual moment that's kind of cringe-inducing.
What the f*** is that?!
Plus, I didn't really find the beginning joke all that funny. It also feels a bit weird that now SpongeBob feels bothered by Patrick's filth, because I'm pretty sure there were some times before this episode where SpongeBob was completely okay with it. But if you're willing to look past those, I think you might have a good time watching this episode. And let's be real here, it's leagues and bounds better than most other gross out episodes. I dare you to convince me otherwise.
Run, Mr. Krabs! Patrick is digging for gold!
Gold?
Did you get any of Patrick's gold?
He's not digging for any gold I'm looking for.
Number 3. The Big Switch. In an attempt to make the Krusty Krab more fancy, SpongeBob is put in a chef's exchange program, where he's transferred to a fancy restaurant. There, SpongeBob tries to adapt as the head of the kitchen orders him to make something other than a Krabby Patty. While back at the Krusty Krab, Krabs transforms it into a fancy restaurant while trying to stay under a low budget, which becomes a bit of a problem. I feel like the pacing of this episode is a bit off. Like, if they added more time to this episode, I'm sure we could have gotten more moments between the Krusty Krab and fancy restaurant. But that being said, this episode is still pretty enjoyable. There were a lot of moments that had me laughing. I think what makes this episode hilarious are its characters, both new and old. Like the head chef of the fancy restaurant. Almost everything he says or does in this episode is hilarious.
I would not wipe my own bottom with this. Step over. And this. I would not wash my own bottom with this after carefully wiping and wiping and wiping.
And to see SpongeBob try to make something new and end up with the same thing had me chuckling. It got a bit on the nose at some points, but it wasn't too frustrating. Plus, the moments with the exchange chef and Mr. Krabs were pretty funny. Mainly with how Mr. Krabs tries to stay under a budget with renovation.
This is not the chair I ordered.
Yeah, well, you see, those were out of stock.
And this fork of plastic, spray painted to look silver, is it not?
Plus, I never actually questioned Mr. Krabs' actions. It feels legitimately believable, and it never comes across as too selfish or malicious, unlike most other episodes. Overall, while I don't think this is the funniest episode of this season, I still really enjoyed it. If only I could see a bit more of it.
Its naturally rancid odor can only be neutralized by shredded gold.
Shredded gold?
Number 2. Friend or Foe. This half-hour special is an origin story on Krabs and Plankton's rivalry and how the Krabby Patty came to be. You see, the two of them used to be best friends during their childhood, but when they come up with the idea to make their own burger after being rejected by a famous burger joint owner, their goals soon get out of hand as their friendship is tested. This is easily the best origin of the Krusty Krab and Krabs and Plankton's rivalry. It's actually kind of nice to see Mr. Krabs and Plankton as childhood friends, and their motivations feel 100% believable, with how the two were constantly made fun of by other kids, and how one guy was able to gain the kids' love and respect by making a burger. Although, I really didn't like Krabs and Plankton painting off each other as the bad guy. The reasonings do make sense, but the way they present it is still a bit off. Plus, I can tell from the get-go that they were lying about what really happened. But I think the explanation between Krabs and Plankton's rivalry more than makes up for it. Plus, I really did enjoy the Patchy segments in this episode. They were consistently funny, and we do see more of his relationship with Potty. And they do manage to connect it well with the plot of the episode. Oh, and did I mention the episode itself is really funny? Because there were a lot of laugh-out-loud moments.
I'm terribly sorry, Eugene. I couldn't hear you. Could you come closer? Maybe stand on the tile in front of you?
Which one? The one that says eject or the one that says trapdoor?
Oh, either one will do.
What I was saying was...
This is another episode I can definitely see the praise in, because there are a lot of things about this episode that really do stand out. Plus, there are a few episodes where they do call back on this. And thank God, because this easily is the best origin between Krabs and Plankton's rivalry, like I said. And even on its own, it's a really great special. Not their best special, but a great one nonetheless.
Here you are, sir. You are the first to taste a Krabby Patty.
Number 1. Krabs a la mode. In this episode, Plankton comes up with a plan to use Krabs' thermostat to freeze the Krusty Krab, knowing Krabs would be too stubborn and selfish to turn up the temperature. This doesn't go as planned, as SpongeBob easily adapts to the cold temperature and uses it to his advantage, which manages to attract twice as many customers to the restaurant who even adapt to the restaurant as well. Maybe it's the whole winter aesthetic, but there's something about this episode that keeps me coming back to it. This episode does a lot of things correctly. For instance, the plot of Mr. Krabs turning the Krusty Krab into an ice rink is pretty clever. Sure, it wasn't his idea, and SpongeBob was the first to adapt to it, but he eventually learned to use all that to his advantage. And of course, this leads to a lot of funny moments. There were plenty of times where I found myself laughing.
There's two ways ways to get on me bad side, boys. I don't like kids playing in the yard, and nobody but me touches me thermostat.
That's totally selfish.
Yeah, your yard is really fun. There are kids playing on it right now.
What? Hey, you kids get off of my lawn!
And Plankton was his usual great self throughout this episode, since he was the one who came up with the idea to freeze the Krusty Krab. And to see it all backfire on him had me chuckling. Plus, again, the whole aesthetic is pretty appealing to me. Like, I liked seeing the Krusty Krab on ice. And the fact that everyone manages to adapt to the winter theme can lead to some really fun moments. I just don't really know what else I could possibly say. I just really love it. It's just all around fun. And that's why Krabs a la Mode is easily my favorite episode of Season 5.
I don't care if Santa Claus and Jack Frost are having ice cream cones. Don't touch that thermostat!
So those are my picks for the best of Season 5. And with all that, I've now reviewed the first 5 seasons of SpongeBob SquarePants. And, oh boy, we're now going to be approaching the Dark Era territory. And I'm going to be reviewing the best and worst of Season 6 again! Ugh. So until then, I suggest you hit the subscribe button and notification bell to know when that video is out. Also, leave a like on this video and tell me your favorites and least favorites of Season 5 in the comment section below. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next one.